Señoras y señores, ¿conocen a Lawrence? We have the great honor, because it's a great honor.
It's a very great honor. It always is. It's amazing to be able to share the stage with the following gentlemen.
We are inviting to the stage Noam Chomsky. Welcome.
Okay. He's in the middle. Big chair.
Do you feel comfortable?
Fine.
Thank you. Okay. I have an idea, if you allow me. I will divide this brief and great honor to be with you in 3 different stages. The first one, we want just to know a little bit about you. But my friend Lawrence told me that he's a very good friend of yours and that he knows you pretty well. So in the first part, I will ask Lawrence questions about Chomsky, Professor Chomsky, and if he's not correct in the answer, please say beep.
Beep?
If you don't like my question, say I pass. Okay?
Okay.
In the second part, Lawrence, I invite you that we have a dialogue of course, in relation with your thinking of which are the greatest risks that we're going to face as humanity. What should we do in relation with the United States and Donald Trump now there? Questions about your ideas of where he's going, linguistics, and things that you have been working on that you have make actually history on those topics. And at the end, in the third stage, if you don't mind and you allowed me, because I have to be very honest with you, we have had here many people, but it's very easy to make an interview of a specific topic. But you are in so many topics, and I want to cover so much and discover more than cover with you so much that if you allowed us, at the end, in the third stage, we could ask him just like one word, and if you could answer with one word what comes to your mind. If you want to. If not, you could say beep or I pass or whatever, okay?
Okay.
So it will be like an association game at the
Word
end.
association, okay?
Do you agree?
All right.
Okay.
Okay.
Esto es con el fin de conocer a profundidad en 20 minutos a Noam Chomsky. Primero, cómo lo conoce una gente desde fuera. Después, cómo vamos a profundizar en algunos temas. Y después, ¿qué es lo primero que le viene a la mente con determinadas palabras de asociación? ¿Estamos de acuerdo? My friend. Aquí está. Here is it, if you want.
Oh, this is my whiskey.
It's because Lawrence told me that the only condition is that I bring whiskey to the table. I say, that's okay. Tú estás, dice, ¿dónde está el whisky? Pues allá está.
Can I say beep?
You can say beep.
Because I know it's really a glass of water.
Yes. Okay.
Okay.
It is whiskey, actually. It's okay.
Okay, we will start just...
I needed it after the debate. Okay. Anyway.
Is Professor Chomsky, he prefers to read fiction or non-fiction?
Nonfiction.
He prefers arts. He prefers arts or music.
Which?
Arts.
Well, both
Or
are
arts or
but
music. I say
I
arts.
mean plastic arts.
Arts? Am I right?
It'll pass.
Okay, good. Okay.
He likes to make sports, to do sports.
He's an athlete.
Beep.
And that's the other thing about Noam Chomsky. He's honest.
Bravo, un aplauso.
Beep.
Professor Chomsky is much more interested in political issues or in linguistic issues.
I didn't hear.
Pass.
He hates more Donald Trump or whom? Who would you say?
Oh, jeez. Oh my God. Gee, I don't know. Why don't you answer that one? I don't think, you know what? I think Noam doesn't hate people. He's just disappointed by them.
I'm not disappointed because I don't expect much.
Ah, there we go. There we go. Excellent.
But I don't hate him. I hate what he does, but not him.
In fact, Noam once said to me something very important, I think, that really influenced me, which was, what people think isn't as important as what they do. I countered it by saying that what they think affects what they do, but I think it's very important. It affected me, because actions, I think, are really the key. And I learned that, one of many things I've learned from Noam.
Well, Lawrence, you're a very atheist person. Actually, you are one of the leaders of the movement of the new atheism.
I'd like to not think of it as a movement, more as common sense.
What's the opinion of Chomsky related to new atheism, and does he believe in God?
I think Noam and I are in agreement that the notion of God is, the standard notion of God is ridiculous. But I think Noam, I hate to speak for you,
Go ahead.
but
It's better than what
would
I
say,
do.
if I would say that there are so many more important things to worry about than God right now that we should be talking about other things. Would you agree?
Do you agree?
Yes.
Oh, good.
Wow.
Okay.
So you know him pretty well. He prefers to sleep early and wake up early, or he's much more like a night person?
Let me see if I can see how honest he is. He loves to wake up early.
Beep.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, now we will go to other questions. I don't know, and I wrote 3 of them, but...
Okay, sure. I think people want to hear from Noam, especially more than
Yes,
me.
this is for you. What are the largest, for you, what are the largest existential risks we face?
Now?
Yes, and how do these reflect on ongoing socio-political issues, on your perspective?
Well, we face several very severe crises. In fact, this generation has to answer questions that have never risen in human history. Will the species survive in any recognizable form? And there are a number of these. One is a shadow that's been hanging over us for over 70 years, and that is, can we survive the threat of nuclear war? I remember very well August 6th, 1945. Won't go into the details, but my feeling at once was right away, human beings have, human intelligence has finally achieved the capacity to destroy ourselves. And ever since then, it's come very close, several times, much too close for comfort.
Noam, can I ask you to be personal? Because I know this story. I think your personal story is a good one. Your reaction at the time, I think, is remarkable and reflects remarkably on your thinking. So I think people would like to hear the personal story.
Well, I was a counselor at a summer camp in August, and in the morning there was an announcement to everyone that the United States had dropped an atom bomb on Hiroshima, and everybody listened, and then they all went off to their normal activities, baseball game, swimming, whatever it might be. And I was kind of doubly appalled, first of all, at the enormity of what had just happened and its implications, which are pretty obvious. I mean, you knew as soon as you heard it that soon it's going to escalate into a capacity to destroy, which will be essentially unlimited. So first that, but secondly, at the lack of reaction. And nobody seemed to care. And it was so appalling that I just couldn't handle it. I took off and walked into the woods and sat there alone for a couple hours and thinking about it, and then came back. And ever since then, it's, of course, never been out of my mind, and I've followed it pretty closely, and the record is really astonishing. First of all, just the record of near accidents, but then also the record of extremely reckless behavior by political leaders, including those who are honored, often honored for the actions that they took in this connection. When you look closely, it's almost a miracle that we've survived.
It really is, and I think young people don't who are sort of complacent because 1945 seems so far back in their memory, don't realize how every day we're on the brink in many ways. There's still thousands of weapons on high alert.
Yeah. Well, actually, William Perry, who you know very well, has spent a career in nuclear strategy, control over nuclear weapons, former defense secretary, a very reserved, quiet, non-alarmist person, plays down the dangers. He now says that he's doubly terrified at the threat that we face, which he says is more extreme even than during the Cold War, and even more terrified by the fact that nobody seems to care.
Yeah,
it's very much like August 6th.
I was with him last week in the Bulletin, and he told me that's amazing. In the height of the Cold War, we had 70,000 nuclear weapons. We've now got maybe 10,000. He says it's more dangerous now than then.
And in relation with that debate that we had,
well,
the other risk of climate change.
And the second comparable threat, and this one is inexorable, it's coming. Maybe in the case of nuclear weapons, at least we know in principle how to solve the problem, just get rid of them, and that can be done. In the case of climate change, it's not at all obvious that we know the answer, but it's coming, it's dangerous, the signs are already obvious, the scientific basis is very convincing, it's very serious. Just to take one example, happened to be mentioned by Stephen Chu, Nobel laureate in physics, a former energy secretary, recently gave a talk in which he pointed out that the last time that the Earth was just a little warmer than it is today was about 120,000 years ago. And at that point, the sea level was 6 to 9 meters higher than it is today. The National Commission on Climate Change, U.S. National Commission, just came out with a report a couple of weeks ago. The Trump administration, of course, dismissed it, in which they predicted that within this century, there's a fair possibility that the sea level might rise about 2 meters if we continue on our current course. And you don't have to have much of an imagination to imagine what kind of a world it would be if the sea level were, say, even a meter higher than it is today. What would happen, for example, in a country like Bangladesh, a coastal plain with hundreds of millions of people? If you think there's a refugee problem today, just imagine what it'll be then, or what it would be like if New York City were half underwater, and so on. The social and economic and personal consequences to agriculture, probable huge drought in Mexico, on and on. The consequences are immense. And just take a look at this morning's paper. You read the reports from the meetings in Bonn. There was a major conference in Paris, as most of you know, in 2015. It aimed to reach a treaty, a verifiable treaty, but it could not do so for one reason. The Republican Party in the United States, which is, in my view, the most dangerous organization in human history. It's an outrageous comment, but I think it's accurate. There's never been an organization in human history which was dedicated to making it impossible for human life to continue in organized form. And that's what we face. So Paris had just a voluntary meetings. The next conference following Paris was in Morocco. It was taking place in last November. The conference came to a stop on November 8th because of the news from the United States. And then the question was, can the world even continue with the most powerful state in human history refusing to participate in the effort to deal with the problem, and worse, dedicated to escalating the problem, which is a fact. The last meeting is right now, just finished, and the basic conclusion from the meeting is that most countries are not meeting their promises, and even to the extent that they are, we seem to be moving towards a future where optimistically there will be 3 degrees centigrade rise over the industrial period, which is a catastrophe. And it could be higher, because as Lawrence can explain better than I can, there are very likely possible nonlinear consequences coming, things that will suddenly explode, like as the permafrost melts, as it's doing, huge amounts, vast amounts of carbon are going to be released, mostly methane, which is very lethal. And this could start an escalating cycle. It could rapidly escalate the melting of the glacier ice caps, the Antarctic ice, and this could just explode. We're right on the cusp of possible catastrophes, and we're not taking it anywhere near seriously enough. That's the second. Third major crisis is a pandemic. And in fact, the permafrost melting may lead to an uncontrollable pandemic. Nobody knows for sure. But buried in there are bacteria that humans have never had any contact with. In fact, they go back eons. When they become released, nobody knows what happens. These are the experiments that we're carrying out, as Lawrence pointed out this morning. We're carrying out an experiment with the environment that is necessary for survival, and the results of this experiment could be not too bad, we're not too sure, but it could be utterly disastrous. And in that respect, it's rather like nuclear weapons. So yes, we're facing these things right now.
Noam, let me elaborate, because I know we've had a discussion recently on stage about this, but when you talk about Bangladesh, in the same newspaper articles, as you probably know, the Seychelles and Fiji are already experiencing problems. We're already asking for aid, because right now it's hard to get fresh water because the salt water is intruding because the sea level has already increased. And one of the real tragedies of climate change is that the countries that created it are not the ones that are going to suffer as much as the other countries. My parents owned a little store when I was a kid, and they used to have a sign above all the pottery saying, "If you break it, it's yours." We've broken it. But these people are asking for help. And I know you've talked about, in some sense, the moral issue, the fact that this is an example of people who really, of efforts to not care about others. And I know you can elaborate on that in a more coherent way.
The scientist who's the head of environmental issues in Bangladesh recently pointed out that we're facing a situation in which tens of millions of people in Bangladesh, maybe hundreds of millions, will have to flee. And he says it's the responsibility of the people who created this problem. The rich, developed societies did basically create the problem that is now being already having a devastating effect on poorer people who had nothing to do with the problem. And that does pose an immense moral problem for the rich. It's very much like the so-called refugee crisis. It's actually a moral crisis for the West. People are fleeing from Africa to Europe, dying in the Mediterranean, thousands dying in the Mediterranean. The Europeans are trying to keep them away from our shores, just like the country to the north, keep them away. Why are people fleeing from Africa to Europe? There's a couple of centuries of answers to that, which go right up to the present. It's not ancient history. Take the Congo, which ought to be one of the richest countries in the world. It was devastated by the Belgians, tens of millions of people killed. It goes right to the present. 1960, Congo did decolonize. The Belgians technically pulled out. The Congo had a charismatic, young, highly capable, highly respected political leader, Patrice Lumumba, The CIA was instructed to murder him. They didn't manage to do it because the Belgians got there first, killed him, tortured him. The United States and the Western countries then supported a murderous kleptomaniac, Mobutu, who devastated the country afterwards. And right at this moment, every one of you who has, say, an iPhone or any of these devices is benefiting from the contemporary genocide in the eastern Congo. The multinational corporations are hovering around the eastern Congo while militias are murdering, slaughtering people. Millions have been killed in the last couple of years so that minerals can be extracted which go straight into your iPhone. These things are happening right now. Now people are fleeing from Africa, French Africa, Belgian Africa, British Africa, to Europe, and the Europeans are trying to arrange for them to die in the Mediterranean and say they're facing a refugee crisis. This is exactly duplicated in the United States and Central America and Mexico, same story. It's a serious moral crisis and should be viewed that way, not a refugee crisis. And the same is true of the environmental crisis. It's a moral crisis for those who have perpetrated this situation. And in fact, have done so not so much because they wanted to destroy the environment, but because they're following principles which guarantee destruction of the environment. I mean, there's a very simple property, familiar property of market systems, very well known to economists or anyone who even thinks for a minute. In a market system, if you make a transaction, say, I sell Lawrence a car, if we're paying attention, we make a good deal for ourselves, but we don't pay any attention to what economists call externalities, the effect that this transaction has on you. And it has an effect. There's more pollution, there's more traffic jams, there's more accidents. It may seem like a small effect for each person, but it multiplies. When Goldman Sachs makes a risky transaction, they, if they're paying attention, take into account the potential risk for themselves, but they do not take into account what's called the systemic risk, the probability that if they may have a loss, the whole system may crash, which in fact came very close to happening in 2008, required a huge government bailout of a big insurance company and others to make sure that this is, and we're doing that with the environment. We're tossing garbage in the other guy's back lawn. That's a necessary property of market systems. What the effect on the environment is not a cost that one takes into account in market behavior. These are deep-seated problems of modern Western society.
Given that time, we'll make you very briefly questions, and if you could answer, like, I mean, even the best economists, like Gary Becker or Milton Friedman or whoever, understand that markets have failures and that there are externalities. But they also understand that the market system could solve those problems. So, for example, you mentioned that the cause of part of the climate change issue, and it's very well developed by Harding, is the tragedy of the commons. And it's the market failure that what it is of everyone is of no one. And you create externalities when you don't take into account the cost that you provoke to others. But how about if this problem, that we know what it is, as you explain it, and how happened, which you explain it, through a market failure, is not being solved also through a market solution? Tax, or put quotas, or etc., to the group, the corporation, the person, or the country that are creating the externality. And that's part of the market system. It's a not perfect system, and we know it, I believe, probably very different than you, that it's the best system that we have, but it also has its own solution. We cannot solve this externality through a market system that internalize the cost through the people or the corporations that create them?
Well, first of all, we should recognize that we have a very partial market system.
Yeah.
It's not simply the case that fossil fuel companies try to maximize their profit. They are also very heavily subsidized. There's hundreds of billions of dollars.
About $400 billion is the most recent estimate for subsidizing fossil fuels.
So there's a huge amount of taxpayer subsidy to the fossil fuel corporations. We're essentially paying them to destroy the commons. The same is true of financial institutions. Huge public subsidies. So it's a very mixed market system. It's the kind of system you'd expect when you ask who designs it. It's a system that's designed. It doesn't just grow naturally. And it's naturally designed in the interests of the designers. That should be a big surprise. So if you look at the so-called trade agreements, what the commentators call free trade agreements, they're not free trade agreements. They're agreements designed by corporate executives, by lobbyists, by investors for their interests. They're investor rights agreements. What happens to the population is a kind of a side consideration. It's another externality. And the semi-market systems we have are highly distorted systems. You see it right in Mexico. Take, say, NAFTA. One element of NAFTA was that U.S. agribusiness should have free access to Mexican markets. Well, U.S. agribusiness doesn't work on a market system. It gets huge subsidies from the taxpayer. And it's perfectly obvious that no matter how efficient Mexican campesinos can be, they're not going to compete with highly subsidized corporate agribusiness. So it naturally drives them off the land and so on. Now, when you get to the solution to this problem within our semi-market systems, yes, they can be adapted to be in the interests of people, not corporations. Actually, what you see happening right now is pretty dramatic. In the United States, solar energy, by now, thanks mainly to China, is becoming by market principles alone, an appropriate technology, even for those who make profit, like Koch Industries uses solar panel. Yeah. But there is an effort underway by corporate-backed organizations to try to get the states to prevent the use of solar power by introducing legislation which will make it more expensive. So, for example, if you put solar panels in your house in the United States, up until now you've been able, when there's excess power, you were able to send it back to the grid and get credits for it. They're trying to cut that off, which will make it harder. And where we live, in Arizona, the sun is shining all the time. And every house ought to have solar panels. But the corporate system is trying to impose legislation which will prevent people from doing it. That's not markets. That's concentrated power trying to shape and manipulate markets in their interest, and it can be done differently. There's also another point that we should bear in mind. Up until the modern state capitalist system was revolutionary in many ways. One of the ways in which it was revolutionary is that it slowly, over time, and over enormous resistance, changed people's attitudes towards labor, towards each other, and towards the commons. The traditional commons in England, elsewhere, were nurtured by the population. If you've read the Robin Hood novel, these stories, they're about defense of the commons against the predators. And that was the normal way in which societies existed. You took care of the common possessions on which you on which your existence was based. They were the source of food, of fuel, of welfare, and so on. The enclosure movements in England, which drove people off the commons and privatized them, was the beginning of the policies of institution of capitalist institutions and morality, which means forget about the commons. And it's pretty striking that today it's traditional societies that are still dedicated to trying to beat back this attempt to destroy the environment.
What about if we have very little time?
Yeah, I was going
to make a question, I make a question, and you close, please.
Yeah, sure. I mean, you know, the point is that I know we're running short of time, but I was, when I first got to know Noam when I was in MIT, and the great thing about the physics department is they don't make you take classes, so I took Noam's class on American foreign policy instead. And I learned something which is just so obvious, and in the context of what you're saying, said a 4-year-old would expect that foreign policy is not carried out for altruistic reasons, that each country does what's in the benefit of the people who are most powerful in that country. And I think this is, I mean, it's, if you asked anyone who hadn't been schooled on all the propaganda that's given out, it would be obvious. And I think the context of what you're saying is exactly that, right? I mean, it's what I learned from you, is that just ask who's benefiting, and it's not surprising that that's what happens.
Well, everybody who's interested in this topic, he wrote an amazing book, Who Runs the World, and many other books about media and how they create propaganda. And you could share his values or not. I think it's a big debate.
Yeah.
But the other great part of Noam Chomsky, and which is the one that I like the most, is what he really makes as a landmark.
Yeah.
Before him, we thought that all the long languages that we learn as kids was not actually because we have like a algorithmic, genetical system in our brain, but that we're born with a kind of an innate software that allows us to learn languages. My question now in relation from shifting from politics to which is the topic that I love that you have put on the arena is about linguistics and in a way it has a lot to do with evolutionary psychology.
And mind.
My question is this one. In your theories you explain, okay, we have political part. We arrived to this system because the powerful people and the interest and whatever. But now I go to psychology and evolutionary linguistics. How did our genes arrive with that software? My question is this because for an evolutionary way, that's why we have this software to acquire languages, or is only a genetical mutation from nowhere with no purpose? I have always had that question for you. I don't want to miss it. Please.
Well, since it's happened, it's evolution, because that's the way things happen. And evolution has many possible factors that enter into it. One of them is, which everybody's familiar with, is adaptation and survival. Another one is the creation of the options that enter into the struggle for survival. That's mutation. So things happen for all kind of accidental reasons, a cosmic ray, whatever it might be. There are slight changes in genes. They change the nature of the organism. Some of them are successful adaptations, many are not. Many of the successful adaptations die out because you have to spread over a population. But over time, organisms change. That's evolution. Homo sapiens, as far as we know, is about, we humans, we're about 200,000 years old. That's the rough origin of anatomically modern humans. There's no evidence of any symbolic behavior prior to the appearance of humans. We now know by genomic analysis that human populations, which were originally very small populations in Africa, began to split roughly 125,000 years ago. And the splits, the different groups, have essentially the same cognitive faculties, including linguistic faculties. So we therefore know that the appearance of these capacities in the genomic structure are prior to the separation and probably after the creation of the emergence of modern humans, which is a flick of an eye in evolutionary time. That's no time at all. So what appears to be the case is that our cognitive capacities, which include linguistic capacity, appeared along with modern humans. And what was it? Well, that gets into a question of what's going on in the brain that provides these specific mechanisms, many of which we are coming to understand, that yield this unique capacity. Somebody before, you may recall, said we're entering into a digital world. Well, actually, humans entered into a digital world about 200,000 years ago. The human language is one of the very rare digital systems in the biological world. Above the level of DNA, you really don't find any others. But something happened along with modern humans that created a digital system. This, incidentally, a system which allows us to construct an infinite array of thoughts and transmit them to others who can penetrate into our minds and find out what we're thinking. I should say that this capacity amazed the founders of early modern science. Galileo regarded it as the greatest, he said, invention, we would now say development in all of human history. The capacity to create an infinite array of structured expressions, digitally infinite, which is critical. It's digitally infinite and forms thoughts, articulates them, expresses them. Others, in the words of Galileo, can penetrate into the workings of our soul. This is a most amazing fact, and it's the core of human nature. It's nothing remotely like it in the animal world. And there's the bare beginnings in the neurosciences of trying to make some guesses about what might be involved in this.
We will go to the third section very quickly.
Oh, I just wanted to add to that, because when we've talked before, one thing you said, which I think is remarkable. First of all, what's fascinating is how early modern humans were. They're very similar to us. But the fact that language, as you said, what we've discussed, which I think really amazed me, was not primarily to communicate, but to internalize thoughts. And I think that maybe that's worth emphasizing. Maybe you could speak on that for a minute.
If any of you just think about it, you can't go 5 seconds without thinking internally in language. You're constantly doing something which we regard as basically talking to yourself. A tiny percentage of that gets externalized. And some of that is used for communication.
Yes.
And actually, if you look more closely, there's no time to go into it here, what you are thinking in your mind is a kind of externalization of what's going on internally. We now have very good evidence that there's a lot of mental computation forming the expressions that reach awareness. And it's happening before awareness, and it's impenetrable to introspection, but it's happening constantly. That's just an intrinsic part of your nature.
We just have 4 minutes,
sure.
Very quickly, 3 minutes, to make you very quickly questions and answers. This is a yes-no question. Okay, as we have this innate cognitive quality to learn languages, do we have the same innate attribute for moral values as humans, yes or no?
Well, that's an interesting question, which is just coming under investigation. There's actually very interesting work by a man named John Michael. He's now a professor of law at Georgetown. I was one of the supervisors of his dissertation. He did a brilliant dissertation in which he was trying to show that there's a common moral kind of grammar. Since then, there's other work by Mark Hauser and others who've done comparative work with children, to see if there are deep moral principles which are just part of our common nature. And all of this is just at the edge of research and a very live topic.
Palabras de asociación.
Oh, another question. Okay, good. Well, as I was thinking, you were talking about word association. Let me just say Adam Smith.
Adam Smith? Well, my dream of going back in time travel would be to be in Edinburgh talking to Adam Smith and David Hume.
I was going to say David Hume, actually, because
That's
I know you're
not a
interested in
simple
David
association.
Hume. Okay, very quickly, one word, Skinner.
Skinner, I can't give a word because it's too complicated. Skinner devised a very useful experimental technique called operant conditioning. It's very good for training pigeons and things like that. It's used in pharmaceutical corporations to tell whether a pigeon is being affected by a drug and so on. He tried to expand it way beyond this, and that failed completely.
Tres preguntas.
Okay, it's a pass. Okay, let me think. Physics.
Physics
is something I wish I were smart enough to understand well.
One word, Mexico.
Mexico?
Mexico. What comes to your mind?
What comes to my mind is too far from God and too close to the United States.
Okay. How about...
You got that together.
That was a good one. How about the next question is...
Sorry, I couldn't hear.
One word to come to your mind. Así.
One word.
Donald Trump.
Trump? Again, I can't give one word. He's a very successful con man. You shouldn't take seriously his pronouncements. I don't think they mean anything. They have two purposes. One, to keep him the focus of attention, which means they have to be more outrageous every day. Second, to ensure that his popular base remains loyal. And the popular base, which is maybe a third of the population, has really totalitarian attitudes. They have faith in their God, Trump, beyond anything else. And he has to keep them under control if he's going to maintain his position of power. Now, what is he using it for? He's using it to direct attention to him, while the really savage wing of the Republican Party, the Paul Ryan wing, are busy carefully dismantling every element of the federal government that works for the benefit of people, of workers, of consumers, and meanwhile concentrating power and wealth in their true constituency, which is ultra wealth and corporate power. That's what we see happening. The world can suffer from it and will suffer from it.
My dear friend Lawrence, one word. Noam Chomsky.
Hero.
Hero. Señoras y señores, Noam Chomsky nació en las ideas. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much.